it's fundamentally a Christian instinct. It's like, we've got all this money. Industrialization has provided these incredible resources. We should be able to make it so people aren't hungry anymore and everybody can reach human fruition to whichever extent they'd like to. And obviously, government's the best way to do that.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Rory, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Robert Morris. How are you this time?
Not bad, not bad. How you doing, Rory?
I'm just very happy that we are preparing for our Chinese overlords.
Oh yeah, that's you're pleased about that?
I think we may try to focus on this Mark fella and his best friend Karl.
Yeah, yes, the Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It's a good segue. It's a good segue. So I have latterly become a lot more interested in socialism, essentially because I think that Donald Trump is going to screw things up so badly that the pendulum is going to swing really hard in the other direction in the United States.
Sanders.
Yeah, we're already seeing that. The Democratic
We'll
Party
need a robotic body by then, because he'd be pushing 90.
True enough. Well, we're seeing a really conscious effort by Bernie Sanders to sort of inaugurate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, as his successor.
Because she's under 60.
Rory, I think she might still be under 40.
So she couldn't run for president? She's too young?
No, she can. I think she should be 35. I don't know. That's a great question. How old is AOC?
I always thought it was 40, but I could be wrong.
No, I think it is 35, and she is 35 this year. So there you go.
That would be crazy, her up against someone in like their 80s if Trump's running for the third term.
Well, no, I think it could be AOC Vance, actually.
Vance is very uncharismatic.
They're both younger than I am. I don't know. That'd be interesting. The Democratic Party is desperately trying to push this abundance agenda, which is essentially libertarianism, deregulatory Reaganism for the Democratic Party, which is, I think, very useful in California or New York, and essentially going to be a dead fish on the national stage, as was Hillary Clinton's, pro-bank fervor and Kamala Harris's.
Do you think it's a hard thing to describe, because it sounds a bit woolly? It's like things are kind of the same but a bit different, and if you're poor, you're probably going to stay poor. Like, it doesn't have a lot to hope for, this sort of Hillary Clinton way of things.
Well, yeah, and that's what they're desperately trying. A lot of the same people who brought us Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton are trying to set up this, are basically trying to keep the Democrats Republican, or trying to keep the Democrats as pro-business as possible. And you contrast that with the millions of dollars behind this big rollout. Ezra Klein, the sort of chief abundance guy, got to go on Jon Stewart's podcast, and they're doing everything to push this forward. And Bernie and AOC are doing events for 30,000 people in Los Angeles, over 10,000 people in red states. It's truly, like, it's clear to me. And again, we're only 3 months into the Trump administration, and he's already lost pretty much anybody who's literate. And it's only going to get worse from here. We saw, Rory, in the first Trump administration, a rampage towards the left. A lot of the folks who are trying to push this democratic libertarianism, the abundance agenda, managed to funnel that into stuff that didn't actually mean much. Stuff that that's inappropriate. No, stuff that was easy to funnel into, well, let's not pay any attention to how we organize the economy or politics. Let's focus on how nasty cops are to African Americans. Let's focus on how bad it is for women in the workplace. Those are very legitimate, very real concerns, but they are not actually changing anything fundamentally in a country that desperately needs some fundamental change. You can have a very diverse set of institutions that keep everything running the way they are and keep more and more of the country falling into economic misery and desperation. But, you know, with a black CEO or what have
But
you.
do you think a lot of that was optics? Because remember, famously, ads are very backward. So it's as soon as like once you start to, they're generally like 10 years behind society. So once you start to have them having, same sex couples and lots of different races, they kind of then all go mad and overdo it. So it creates this idea that like things are significantly more woke than they actually are? Like, do you think there was a lot of stuff that it appeared to be significantly more inclusionary and non-binary and all this, when in reality it was a lot of white guys in suits?
Yes, but also, like, I think w the goals were really limited. The sort of the goal of sort of Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris abundance is that, like, we can have exactly the same system we have with the same horrific insurance companies that are essentially farming people for, you know, for sickness. We can still have these banks that own everything. We can have these big tech monopolies that take more and more of your life. As long as it's female,
Girl
as
boss.
long as BIPOCs are in charge. And like that's I mean, that was like their legitimate goal and their legitimate approach. And the reaction to Trump was very skillfully corralled into that stuff that didn't actually change anything. But even with that, you had the rise of AOC, who actually does want to change the economic and political system of the United States. You had the rise of a whole range of other progressive politicians. There was definitely a backlash to that, in part because a lot of people were like, okay, so we're supposed to be, you know, more conscious of race and gender, but like I'm still not in any better space economically. That's where a lot of this backlash came from. I think with Trump being as insane as he is, and we've got 45 more months of this, we're going to probably push things in a much more legitimately left wing direction. Like we're actually going to find ourselves trying to do larger socialist projects. In the 2020 Democratic nomination fight, this is partially why Kamala Harris was looked at as such a flip flopper. They were talking about stuff like Medicare for all. They were talking about all kinds of very strong, actual, traditional left wing
But there are
priorities.
also things that tangibly the normal people of America could benefit from.
Exactly, and none of that ended up happening because the same schmucks who, like, corralled us into DEI workshops instead of actually changing anything, also corralled us towards Joe Biden, who almost lost the 2020 election, which an actual left-wing person would have won at a very large, by a very large majority, I believe.
He's only emerged recently. Did you see that?
Oh, Joe Biden has surfaced again,
He
has he?
came out yesterday out of his crypt. Like, it just shows how elderly he is that it's taken him this long. 3 months.
I never wanna hear or think, or talk about Genocide Joe ever again. I hope he has a long retirement reflecting on, what a monstrous person he is.
Could you see it becoming a bit more like the New Deal?
Well, I mean, hopefully, but I think all of this is, I'm sure we'll have many, many, many episodes to, idly speculate about what's gonna happen in 2026 and 2028. But I kinda wanted to dive back into history. I kinda wanted to talk about, you know, what was socialism? What was this sort of approach to things? I think that in the United States, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party very successfully sort of demonize this, which is surprising because the Democrats are the party of the New Deal, the party that put a lot of the social welfare state into place. Yet they have, over the past 45 years, sort of fallen into nodding along with the same Republican Party characterizations of socialism is the root of all evil, and you know, oh, you wanna pay for childcare for somebody? Do you want to live in Venezuela? You know, like that sort
Like,
of.
do you think this is a symptom of the Cold War? Where it's almost like they believe their own hype and propaganda and they can't sort of break away from that?
I think it's a post-Cold War thing,
Hmm.
because during the Cold War, there was a consciousness that the United States had to provide a better deal than the Soviets did. The United States had to actually have a better functioning country. Obviously, we wanted to be capitalist. We wanted to bring about great capitalist success, but we also had to do the socialism. We also had to do the social provision. It's post-Cold War where the capitalists and the wealthy people in charge of the United States are like, we won. We don't have to do any of this. We don't have to do anything for anybody else ever. And that's sort of in this sort of cable news, social media world where it's just like communism evil, is sort of all you have to do and say now. It's definitely related to the Cold War, but during the Cold War, I think it would have seemed well, outs in the mainstream of U.S. political conversation, it would have seemed ridiculous to characterize Social Security or Medicare as communist and sort of evil and Stalinist. It's become quite common, and not just among Republicans. It is the very idea that we would think of raising taxes or think of redistribution or think of using government for anything other than dropping bombs on people. It's been demonized, and I think it's interesting. I think it's important, frankly, if we are going to end up rampaging towards the left again, to know a little bit about what that was like the first couple times around. And I think just for my own personal education, I thought it was worthwhile to kind of dive in on the history of socialism. And I think today we'll probably focus on the 1800s and sort of how all of this developed. And I think probably the main message I want to convey is that this is a historical
Oh,
conversation.
definitely.
These ideologies are so rooted in their own times. In the One of the most frustrating things about the way that we discuss politics in the United States is that it's still so rooted in the 1930s. This idea of fascism, versus communism, left versus right. And certainly it was a very tense and intense period of time, the 1930s. But it's really frustrating how we're like 90 years later now, and these terms that meant something very distinct in the 1930s, but meant something very different by the 1950s, are still thrown around in sort of the same sorts of ways. And what's fascinating about sort of 19th century history of socialism, communism, what have you, is the way that it's still fundamentally so deeply rooted in historical events that were happening in the 1800s that people just sort of don't know much about. And if you don't know much about these events and what was happening, how can you judge any of these political arguments that people make about socialism and communism today? It just sort of doesn't make much sense. So I want to try to shed a bit of a light on sort of what was socialism, because it's something that's constantly changing. And to do that, we've got to, as you said, we got to go back and look at Karl. We got to go back and look at Karl and Friedrich and a whole bunch of other interesting
You
characters.
trying to say it's more than just you're not allowed to own land?
Yeah, there's a little bit more to
Oh.
it than that. A little bit more to it than that. That's actually kind of a conscious, well, there's two parts of this. I think absolutely, and I don't think anybody would disagree, that there are propaganda reasons, there are motivations, self-interested motivations why we're always told to look at Venezuela rather than to look at Sweden, or we're always told to look at Cambodia rather than look at Denmark or what have you, or Medicare in the United States, which is,
Or you could argue 1950s America.
yeah, yes, the horror stories of heavy unionization and a functioning social welfare state.
It's North Korea. It's not so much China anymore.
Exactly, exactly. But there also is.
Oh yeah, it's basically like it's bad China. Bad China's communist, while modern China, oh, it's capitalist.
So there is a lot of that, Rory, but also there are legitimately sinister aspects to the history of socialism and communism. And I'm not just talking about Stalin and Mao and their mass murders.
So you're trying to say you're not a tanky?
I'm not. No, no, I am
Oh.
not. I have not gone full commie. And I assure you, as
So
soon,
you're trying to say Stalin did some things wrong?
yes, Stalin definitely did a lot of things
A
wrong.
bit iffy.
But I am not to excuse, but to sort of explain away, like a lot of the ways that the communist socialist ideology developed are rooted in just how messed up a lot of these historical dynamics were. We're talking about extraordinarily repressive governments in 19th century Europe, in Germany, the Prussians, and especially in Russia. You can't understand the sinister nature, the incredibly bleak things that Soviet communism produced in Russia without understanding just how bleak and nasty the czarist regime that came before them was. They sort of learned this. And if you look at broader issues like Mao in China, Khmer Rouge, Cambodia, when you understand what these, Mao's Great Leap Forward, a horrific crime against humanity, Cambodia's Khmer Rouge wiped out a third of the population of a much smaller country, of course, but
Oh,
and
yeah,
I've been
yeah.
to Cambodia. Horrific. But then when you understand the systems that they were rebelling against, there's a reason why they are as screwed up as they are.
But they would have been sort of rebelling against what we would see as like classical medieval societies.
Oh, no, no,
Oh.
no, no. China is the story of Mao is fundamentally about the century of humiliation and rebelling against European
Mm.
imperialism, and of course Japanese imperialism. Much more, the Japanese being a much stronger version. But yeah, the reason Mao was able to be as powerful as he was able to consolidate the country, was able to commit the crimes he was because China had been so beaten down by first Britain and then Japan, primarily Britain. Yeah, sure, the French and the Germans participated, but it was Britain and then Japan. The reason that the Khmer Rouge was able to institute the incredible, horrifying destruction is because they were rebelling against a corrupt Cambodian system that was in the pay of the Americans that had killed hundreds of thousands of Cambodians with a bombing campaign. That's the direct precedent to the Khmer Rouge's crimes, was rebelling against the United States and its puppet government in Cambodia that killed hundreds of thousands
Mhm.
of Cambodians before the Khmer Rouge killed millions of Cambodians. So it's like, that's what I'm saying is like the historical context in which these movements were built up are just nasty, nasty places. So it's not surprising that the most extreme versions of socialist and communist ideology produced incredible horrors because they were coming out of incredibly horrific times. And something that I think we're not going to get into too much detail on because, we've only got another 40 minutes and not another 4 hours. But this 19th century context that we're going to talking about, where we're going to get to Karl Marx, hopefully
Mhm.
before the halfway point of this episode, was suffused in early nationalism. And nationalism, as we know from our recent episodes on the Kurds, just by its nature, kills tens of thousands. That's just sort
Well,
of,
it instantly creates an in-group, which then likes to celebrate by destroying the out-group.
yes. And this is 19th century Europe, where we get the birth of socialism, communism, what have you, is steaming pot of nationalist anger. Horrifically, Eastern Europe got sorted out into more or less homogenous units, some spaces less, in World War II through horrific mass slaughter. This is the time before the mass slaughter, when everybody's in the process of, the 19th century in Europe, in Germany, in France, UK to a less extent, like that's the point at which people are going through those horrific nationalization processes that we talked about, ripping Anatolia to shreds, ripping Turkey to shreds in the 19 teens and 20s and into the 1990s. So this is when this is happening in Europe. And out of that very venomous stew is where we get socialism and communism. So yes, absolutely. There's this sort of Republican Fox News demonization of socialism and communism, but also there's some legitimately really creepy stuff that comes out of just a really venomous historical context and stew. So socialism, the first shoots of it, and I've been reading a whole. So this podcast is based largely on "To the Finland Station" by Edmund Wilson. It's an
Okay.
interesting. This guy, I think, spent the 1930s writing this book when he was initially very enamored of the Soviet Union, but by the end of the 1930s, he had seen through Stalin massacres and actually was no longer a fan of the Soviet Union. And it's interesting.
The turnaround.
yeah, that context. And then because, I just, want the basics, I read parts of the very short Oxford introductions to socialism and communism. And where all of these start out, well, actually, this one starts out with the history of the French Revolution, which I think is really interesting, actually. Even in the 1930s, I think American intellectuals were still very rooted in what French people were thinking and saying. So he considered it an appropriate preamble to discussing socialism and communism, is just discussing the legacy of the French Revolution and how the French Revolution was talked about by French historians. And he sort of talked about the way how early French historians were more invested in the revolution, and then as time went on, the sort of liberal bourgeoisie historians stopped being interested at all, and then he switches to the socialists. So initially, socialism sort of is these early socialists like Robert Owen and I think Charles Fourier and some other figures were basically would set up their own little societies, was what they would try to do, essentially communes. And some of them were, lasted decades. Most of them lasted a
Did
couple of
not.
years.
Yeah.
Yes. Robert Owen, I think, was a Welsh factory owner, surprisingly, who just had great success during a period of great economic success and being sort of a first mover in sort of setting up much more humane factories and set up a place where, and this is in the late 1700s, early 1800s, when it was shocking, where workers were actually well paid and well educated and this, that, and the other thing. And he tried to set up utopian communities all over. So that's sort of like the roots of socialism. It's only in the 1830s and 40s when we get this idea that actually, no, we're going to completely rewrite the rules of society for everybody. I think perhaps this idea, which was kind of a religious idea, you can argue in some ways the pilgrims, the Protestants that came over from England to the United States initially were kind of utopian socialists. They wanted
Yeah, but
to,
I also heard it was a way of getting rid of those types. It's like, we don't want these people changing our society.
yeah.
Get them on the
Yeah,
boat.
exactly. And there's strong religious roots to this socialist idea. I mean, fundamentally, it's amazing how foul and how just messed up a lot of these things develop to, when it's really it's fundamentally a Christian instinct. It's like, we've got all this money. Industrialization has provided these incredible resources. We should be able to make it so people aren't hungry anymore and everybody can reach human fruition to whichever extent they'd like to. And obviously, government's the best way to do
Because
that.
I think one criticism is that capitalism quite often overproduces, and that's the issue. Instead of sort of making enough for everyone, it's like it tries to overproduce, and then that quite often cause a collapse, or it just means that a small number can profit.
Well, oh man, you're already getting into
Sorry,
capital,
I'm
man. You're
ahead
way
of,
ahead of me. You're
I'm
way ahead of
cheating.
me here.
I'll be talking about
Yeah,
children
yeah.
and factories next.
Yeah, you're way ahead of me, man. But no, so you're already in the 1860s. I'm still
Sorry, I'm too modern.
but no, but it's shocking that such a simple, basic idea, like a classically Christian idea, has led to such nastiness. And I think that has a lot to do with the nastiness of the times in which these were brought
Yeah,
up.
I came from.
So, I mean, if we're looking at like deep historical antecedents, you have the religious revolutionaries during the English Civil War. There's the levelers, were these folks who Oliver Cromwell and the Roundheads were a bunch of religious fanatics, and then there was an even more fanatical bunch that were like, you know what, we should all just have a level society, and there shouldn't be rich people, there shouldn't be poor people, and they were sort of swiftly crushed. During the French Revolution, there were definitely elements of revolutionaries that had leveling instincts, that wanted more economic equality. Specifically, this guy named Gracchus Babeuf, who
Hmm.
led a conspiracy of equals, sort of poorly timed. This is sort of towards the end of
Just the way you
the
say a conspiracy of equals, it's like his evil plan is that we will all be okay.
Yes, yes, that was his evil plan, and he was absolutely executed for it. He sort of came in a couple years before Napoleon, when the revolution was sort of ossifying into sort of a more of a liberal bourgeois, merchant class, republic, before Napoleon took it all over and certainly crushed any socialistic instincts like Gracchus Babeuf. And there was this growing tension across a very revolutionary era. I mean, from the French Revolution, that led to revolutionary wars, and then Napoleonic wars that went all the way up until 1815. So you've got 1789 to 1815. The whole continent is ruled by revolution. In 1820, there's some revolutions here and there. In 1830, there's revolutions here and there. Then 1848, you get to this point where Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are young men in Germany, and they write a little pamphlet called the Communist Manifesto, which is still with us today.
Mm-hmm.
But this dynamic between 1789 and 1848, you had this real tension because in 1789, the revolution back then, it was pretty straightforward. You had middle classes, trading classes, the bourgeoisie, what have you, more or less in agreement with the working class to rebel against aristocracies, to rebel against the kings. Of course, aristocracies and kings are sometimes working against each other, but it was sort of, and it's this growing tension across this half century of revolutions where all of us, the working class and the more commercial classes, realize that actually maybe they don't agree with each other so much anymore. And this becomes a huge dynamic in the 1848 revolutions, the springtime of the peoples. 1848, I use a lot as an analogy for the Arab Spring. It was new communication technologies. The railroad and the telegraph were sort of rolled out in the decade before 1848 across Europe. And what was extraordinary, it was,
Well, I'm always thinking the printing press brought us about Protestantism. So
yeah, and I guess
every new communication brings out something wacky.
yeah, and it gets more, Protestantism to
Whatever
to
next.
uh, to socialism to MAGA, apparently,
Mm-hmm.
is what social media has brought us. 1848, these new technologies, it was not a new thing for revolution to spread from one corner of Europe to another, but it would usually take months or even years just for the news of this revolution to spread. And that was actually very good for the forces of reaction because they could crush something. So, by the time northern France heard that southern France was revolting, the revolution would have been crushed. The telegraph, the railroad, the instant communication meant that all of a sudden the Italians hear that the French are rising, so the Hungarians hear immediately, and then the Germans hear. And you had this incredible rush of essentially worldwide revolution, or
Mm.
continent-wide, peninsula-wide revolution. And the reason why I compare it to the Arab Spring is because it was instantly crushed. Or over the course of 2 or 3 years, much like the Arab Spring, it was crushed. It was all the Hungarians were crushed. Essentially the forces of reaction won. The Russian Tsar, the Austrian emperor, and I guess at that point it was still the Prussian king, were able to rally and crush all of these independence movements. However, 1848 is remembered very positively because eventually the Hungarians, about 15 years later, or was it 10 years later, were able to eventually assert their freedom against the Austrians. The
Okay.
Germans ended up, and German nationalism and Italian nationalism were huge, huge aspects of the 1848 Rising. Of course, at this time, Germany and Italy are completely separate, different principalities, uh, bishoprics, what have you. They all try to unify, they get crushed in 1848. But by the 1860s, I think, in Italy, and by 1870, Italy and Germany are unified. So 1848 is remembered very fondly because even though it was all crushed, it eventually, most of the goals of 1848 ended up getting satisfied. One set of goals of 1848 that did not end up getting satisfied would be those of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It's such an interesting dynamic how, and I'll be honest, none of these books really adequately answer it to me. Like, how exactly did Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels end up being the sort of founders of socialism and communism? It is in the 20th century, I would say, that communism became the description of a certain kind of state, socialism being the much sort of softer version, describing the aspects of a social welfare state
Mhm.
that were incorporated in every Western European country, the United States, what have you. But both of these streams do look back to Karl Marx, and Friedrich Engels, and I'm just it need that these books didn't really answer me why exactly. And I think part of it is that they wrote a really great manifesto. And crucially, because of Friedrich Engels, they had the leisure to just sit back and write about this stuff for the rest of their lives. So in
Because he would
eight,
have been his Patreon, wouldn't he have been?
well, they were partners, is how they were writing partners, this, that, and the other thing. And Friedrich Engels was very willing to act as the second fiddle, despite the fact that he was funding not only his own lifestyle, but was funding the lifestyle of Karl Marx and his entire family in London. So it's a very interesting dynamic, and it's yes, they wrote a really important manifesto, and Marx was in London, which was sort of the hub of worldwide revolution, mostly because the British were happy to have revolutionaries from all over the world live in London because they were generally sort of, a little more friendly to the idea of representative government than anybody else was, and they considered it kind of useful for foreign policy purposes. So Karl Marx lived in London, I think, more or less entirely from 1850. But Marx and Engels are both, uh, I suppose, Prussians would be the appropriate
Oh,
term,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
because Germany is not founded until 1870. But what's interesting is I think certainly Friedrich Engels, and I think Karl Marx as well, were both Prussians who really disliked the Prussian state. This is a really interesting dynamic among 1848ers, not socialists, communists, or whatever, but just liberals more broadly, was that Germany really wanted to unify, but in 1848, they wanted to do it with a parliament that represented all of these areas of Germany in a more representative sense. What ended up happening in 1870, after a series of successful wars, was that the Prussians essentially consolidated and took over Germany. And they made all kinds of allowances for the old nobility, this, that, and the other thing, but it was much less representative of Germanness in general,
Mhm.
differing German identities, certainly than Marx and Engels wanted, but that a lot of just, boring liberal bourgeoisie people wanted. So that's an interesting dynamic, is that Marx and Engels were Prussians, both born in the territory of what was Prussia, but in parts of Prussia that perhaps already resented being part of Prussia, and they were never fans of Prussian leadership of Germany, though they did, and certainly Engels. There's sort of passages here and there that lead one to believe that Engels had some German patriotic instincts or what have you, which sort of ends the story of 19th century socialism. The story of 19th century socialism kind of ends in great disappointment with World War I. 1848, tremendous hope. It's crushed everywhere. Karl
Mhm.
Marx and Friedrich Engels are still both, certainly by the standards of today, but I think even by the standards of back then, are still fairly young men. Friedrich Engels, I believe, actually fights in some of these wars. I don't know if it's against the Austrian emperor or the Prussian king, to try to establish an independent liberal democratic Germany. Karl Marx is writing. And it's interesting, like, I've spent a lot of time reading about the relationship between Karl Marx, his family, and Friedrich Engels, and it's just Karl Marx just seems like a really miserable dude. He just he did have a family, he did have a very long-suffering family, but he was basically like, he was tremendously reliant on a long-suffering wife, and he was tremendously reliant on Friedrich Engels. Friedrich Engels is fascinating figure who was a capitalist, was a factory owner. He came from a family of factory owners doing revolution with Karl Marx. The revolution peters out in the early 1850s, and I don't think Karl actually, told him this, but it seems like Engels realized, like, well, if we're going to keep this revolutionary lifestyle going, I guess I got to go to work. So his day job was like running a factory.
Textiles?
I assume so. I don't know, but running a factory in Germany, and it's extraordinary because his sort of the empirical underpinning of both Marx and Engels's work is a apparently still rather affecting book that Engels wrote about the plight of the working class in Manchester, England
Which would
in
have been
the
like the manufacturing hub of the world at the time.
yeah, and this is true like satanic mills.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean this is just imagine the bleakest existence possible. I mean you can just Google 19th century factory work, 19th century tenements. It's
People
just
getting caught up in machines and all this horrendousness.
it's just people who just would work. I mean, something that socialism brought us was the 40-hour work week. I mean, these were people who would just work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that was their lives. So Engels, that book is kind of a, I think I can't remember the conditions, the working class in England or whatever. It's kind of, I mean, it's a signpost. People still
Oh
read it
yeah.
180 years later. And then after writing that book, to keep Marx writing, he went and spent the rest of his life running a factory, which is quite,
Quite contradictory.
yeah, it's just quite extraordinary, and was apparently quite was deeply impressed with the brilliance of Karl Marx. Deeply believed that they were changing the world, and he was right. They did change the world. And Engels did get to live, I think, for another 12 years after Marx, and sort of came into his own a bit. But yeah, it just Karl Marx, his poor, long-suffering,
He's a very serious man.
yeah, his poor, long-suffering wife. He's got children who are sort of dying of
It was
malnutrition,
the
and
style at the
it's,
time.
I suppose. But yeah, it's he really seems like kind of a nasty dude, and that is where communism comes from. But it was a nasty environment. These were
Oh yeah, yeah. It was a horrendous time and life was cheap.
yeah, these were young men who thought they were changing the world, and instead sort of spent their entirety of their lives waiting for a revolution that never came. Engels slaving away as a slave driver. Marx watching his children die, watching his wife predecease him as well, in extreme poverty in London slums. Interestingly, the apparently Karl Marx's income was mostly American, which was kind of funny to see.
Okay.
The steadiest job he ever had was for the New York Daily Tribune,
Oh.
writing up European news, which is kind of extraordinary.
Were you able to read any? Did it list any of his articles?
So I have there's some other stuff. I'm reading the Communist Manifesto again, and he wrote what
Rob,
is
I'm
this?
pretty sure you're going to get deported at this rate.
Oh yeah, you
Critical
think?
of Israel, reading up.
Yep. We got the Communist Manifesto. We
Yes.
got this is the most famous one, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, basically talking about Napoleon III and what a jackass he was. So I'm excited to get into that because he apparently was quite a powerful writer. Marx had some really, really valuable insights. The focus, I think, confirmed by these books, they try to get away from it a little bit, but the focus on economics above all else. It's fundamentally a Marxist belief. It is something that Marx put forward, and we all kind of believe it. You know, when we're talking geopolitics, we're always talking about GDP numbers, and we just did a whole episode on trade. This idea that it's the economics that matters and everything else is sort of a superstructure on top of it. That is Karl Marx's fundamental insight.
But also how it kind of poisons your mind and your soul because you just justify people in their sort of net worth. Like, what job do they do and how are they? And like, oh, that person's terrible because they don't contribute to society. You know?
That is yes, that is true. That is true. Though interestingly, so Engels, I think, would have been sort of a higher social status than Karl Marx and his wife were. Karl Marx is, I think, the children of folks who had converted from Judaism, so sort of like working his way up. Engels is, the wealthy son of a factory owner. Yet Marx, the founder of communism, apparently looked down on and refused to treat with any respect the partner of Friedrich Engels through most of his lifetime because she was an Irish worker.
Oh, okay.
So Karl Marx, the founder of this egalitarian,
Throw away the shackles. We're all
was
equal.
was basically a nasty snob to the lifelong lover of his best friend and supporter, which is quite extraordinary.
So strange that we probably wouldn't know about him without that, but yet he was horribly rude to his
Yes.
life or income.
But so there's that fundamental insight, and I think a lot of other worthwhile insights to Marxism, but it is tied to this, and I really sort of began to appreciate. Have you ever heard of Hegel?
Yes.
So he's a philosopher
Mhm.
who is I famously difficult to understand. I tried to buy one of his books and try to read it, and he's just like just
The way you said you
incredibly
tried to buy it
complex.
made it sound like he's so difficult they won't even let you buy it without like a quiz.
It's true. You need some kind of licensing to read Hegel. But I tried to read Hegel in my 20s and then gave up and like bought one of these like understanding Hegel or whatever books, like Cliff Notes versions, and it's like kind of interesting, but it's all fantasy. Like it is
Mm.
all, and this is again just sort of a side effect of the weirdness of nationalism, the weirdness of Germany being these divided up countries that are sort of marched over back and forth by Russian and French armies or whatnot. And it's a lot of this German philosophy is just it's an early example of like what happens when you stop believing in Christianity, you'll believe in anything. Like they're
Hmm.
just cooking up this fantastical, oh, well, this is what the world's spirit wants and Geist and it's intoxicatingly fun stuff for like a young man to read, but
They don't talk about ethers or anything, do they?
it's nonsense. It's gobbledygook. It's fundamentally religious thinking that is complicated enough that it is sold as philosophy. Hegel is still very respected, but that is the soil out of which Marx and Engels grew. So they thought they were being much more hard-nosed and realistic than the rest of the German philosophers and the Hegelians. This is something that Edmund Wilson is very good about. They thought they were so much more realistic and hard-nosed, but then you look at what they're talking about, and they're nuts. Like, they're basically, like, personifying history and, it's just religion. And Marxism at its outset was infused with these religious Hegelian beliefs about the destiny of history, what history wanted, dialectical materialism, how, ideas clash and then they form new ideas. And this isn't just philosophical. This is actually how science works as well. Like there's so much in 19th century thought well beyond socialism, communism, Marxism, that is just nuts. And there's a lot of stuff that's just nuts that got baked into Marxism from the get-go. The essential nature of class struggle and a eventual dictatorship of the proletariat and like this is how everything's going to go. That is not actually how anything ended up going. It's a famous frustration to the Marxists of the time that it was only Russia, a place where they were confident there was no possibility of a socialist revolution because there wasn't a bourgeoisie to rebel against. It was still an authoritarian aristocratic state. So there had to, be a completely other stage, and it was only Russia that actually pulled off this dictatorship of the proletariat that they were looking for. But I think, and this is key, it's socialism and the history of socialism is not just Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And a lot of the hardcore communist states of the 20th century wanted to look directly at Marx and Engels, sometimes with Lenin on top, sometimes with Mao on top. But there's
Mhm.
actually a lot more to how socialism developed than just these folks. And you can see that in Marx and Engels talked about the frustrations of trying to deal with all of these other strains within socialism. And they, because of their position as incredibly powerful writers, and the very rarely for the 19th centuries, they had the leisure to just sort of sit back and be
Mhm.
professional revolutionaries. They were able to sort of consolidate a lot of influence behind them. They didn't actually run any of the national parties in, Germany or France or in England, but they managed to be tremendously influential over all of them and sort of be the underpinnings of a international socialist movement until that international socialist movement sort of fell apart around World War I. So there's the first international, and Marx and Engels talk about how irritated they are that they have to cater to all of these people who aren't as hardcore as they are, who don't want the.
They're just posers.
Yeah, exactly. They don't want they can't see, as is obvious, that we must have this class struggle that leads to this big, apocalypse that leads to the proletariat being in charge. Across the 19th century, the more and more people were realizing that actually we can, through democratic means, implement differing, more and more socialist things, which actually ended up working out pretty phenomenally well. The United States has a lot of socialist elements that came in through the Progressive Era and the New Deal. I think it's the SPD, which just lost power in Germany, but I think is in the new coalition, basically started out as was founded by people who read and felt that they owed a lot to Marx and Engels.
The Socialist Democratic Party of Germany.
Yes, that party has survived. The French Socialist Party used to be, I think, there was sort of a duopoly that ran French politics for most of the post-World War II era. The Socialist Party was one part of that. The Labour Party in the UK was always, interestingly, more further away from Marxism than the other parties, because the labor movement in the UK recognized earlier than the rest of Europe that you could actually reach social welfare goals, socialist goals, through the ballot box, through government. And sort of across the end of the 19th century, there's this frustration. In 1848, Marx and Engels are very young men, and they have this great hope that they're going to eventually, next week, they are infinitely more learned and respectable looking, but they are the same thing as evangelical Christians that expect Jesus to come next week, except what they were expecting was a revolution. By 1871, they are old men. Gee whiz.
Yeah.
That's what, 53? Okay, so they're not much older than I am, but they are in the 19th century.
Yes, that was very old at the time.
Yes. So they are, in their 50s, and they see the Paris Commune. Do you know much about the Paris Commune?
I don't, I'm afraid, no.
It is shockingly insignificant development. This is the point at which liberal bourgeois revolutionaries and the social revolutionaries part ways forever. Napoleon III, loses a big war to Germany in 1870, actually gets captured by the Germans, sort of sets the stage for the apocalypse of World War I, 40-odd years later. But in the aftermath, a bunch of left-wing revolutionaries in Paris say, no, we're not going to surrender to the Germans. We refuse. The new post-Napoleon government of France has to take Paris sort of on the behalf of the Germans or something. But you had the Paris Commune for 2 months, a avowedly socialist or communist or whatever, just very left-wing government controls Paris. And this is, of course, a period of time where Paris is at the heart of the European, American cultural imagination in a way that it certainly isn't today. I mean, this is the heart of Europe, and communists take it over for 2 months. Edwin Wilson points out that we hear a lot about the 2,000 people, 2,000 or 3,000 people killed in the French Revolution by the terror of Robespierre and folks like that. We don't hear a lot about the 10 to 20,000 communists that were slaughtered by this French government in retaking Paris and the Paris Commune. So it's this really seminal event. These guys in their 50s are like, finally, the revolution is here. And then it gets crushed in the most miserable way possible. But they continue. There's the First International that Marx and Engels are pretty involved with from 1864 to 1876. Falls apart in sort of some of the aftermath of that. Then there's the Second International, sort of international working men's associations or what have you, which are basically, truly like what the Red Scare people, what Joe McCarthy was worried about, like a true international conspiracy to bring about socialist everything. And the Second International, this is after Marx has died in 1883 and Friedrich Engels is getting quite old. One of the sort of baseline commitments of these working class parties, these socialist parties, was the idea that they were not going to go to war for their empires. that they were not going to get drawn into these wars for capitalism and these wars for aristocrats. That was not for them. And in 1914, to the great disappointment of everybody, almost all of the socialist parties in all of these individual countries signed up in droves, wanted to be part of the war governments. Working men were encouraged to join their armies. And this idea of a unified working class proletariat that had interests separate from the individual petty nationalisms of Europe just sort of died. And who knows if in the aftermath of World War I, there hadn't been a Soviet Union, then perhaps the revulsion from World War I would have given a sort of new impetus to this idea of an international proletariat or something like that. But the problem was that communism, the cause of worldwide socialism, was now championed by the Soviet Union, which was one very interesting and certainly by the end of the 1920s or the end of the 1930s, deeply unattractive avatar of socialism or communism. And it's sort of, I think also crucially from the perspective of Europe, communism and socialism in the 20th century became more of a tool of liberation, of, non-white folks becoming independent. Hard for not as strong a sell to the European working class as it used to be. So I guess the story that I wanted to tell today of sort of what was socialism sort of ends with World War I, when, to the great disappointment of, thankfully Marx and Engels were dead by then. This great idea that the working class would refuse to fight the capitalist class's wars was just, absolutely smashed. And essentially nationalism, which we didn't talk enough about during this episode, sort of beat socialism. That's sort of the way that the first socialist century ended. Though I think it's not quite that hopeless a story, because that agitation, that struggle ended up giving us things like the 40-hour work week, giving us things like governments that provide basic social provision. So yeah, I think that's a good first part. Not sure if there's going to be a second part, but a good first part to
universal child education.
That varies from place to place. In the United States, it kind of predates. That's like a religious thing. I think it sort of gets its start in New England before.
Is that another angle of the sort of quasi-religious aspects of Marxism?
Absolutely, but it all gets sort of like bled together in this, governments providing services, which in the era of Trump, all of that is being condemned as Venezuela, when, it's just another indication of how these definitions are slippery. But it's worth knowing a little something about Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and European revolutions in the 1800s. And I hope we've provided some of that today, and hope people find it worthwhile.
You definitely have. A lot of gaps in my knowledge.
Trying to fill those gaps is what we're here to do.
Slowly but surely, but we'll get there.
Hey, for me too. I'm learning a lot about. It's a very engaging book, To the Finland Station by Edmund Wilson. The Finland Station being Lenin showing up, I think, at the Finland Station in 1917 in Russia to sort of launch the revolutions that formed the Soviet Union. So interesting book. But yeah.
So we'll finish it with what we always finish the episode with is abolish inheritance.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That's what we always say. I will catch you next time.
Yes, yeah.
Ciao, ciao.
All right.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire: What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.